Greetings and welcome back to Room 303, AP English, our World of Ideas lectures. We are in Unit 8 on Poetics, and we now come to Lecture 49, the great Virginia Woolf, who is, of course, she carries canonical status in 303, doesn't she? One of the most important writers for us. We're going to be looking at her letter to a young poet. Now, without question for us, as we've said, Woolf holds very, very high status in 303 and has for a very long time. Why? Not just because she's a woman, but rather because she's one of the most gifted artists that we will read. And of course, yes, the tragic biography we're reminded of, compelling for us already that we are looking now at the end of our World of Ideas, Jacobus's volume lectures, and here now we get to one more time have some conversation with the great Virginia Woolf. Room of One's Own, of course, and Shakespeare's Sister are two of the most important titles in 303 for us. We, of course, have given a number of lectures on Virginia Woolf elsewhere at LearnStrong.net, and our assumption is that you've been following all of our World of Ideas lectures on LearnStrong.net in the AP folder, lectures 1 through 48, and as well as we've said, the Woolf lectures, we've lectured on Dalloway, we've lectured on Shakespeare's Sister, Room of One's Own, etc. We also assume that, of course, you know our learning theory, that is our desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. It was Virginia Woolf in many ways who really was the one who pointed this out so strongly at the beginning of her career. And of course, it had tremendous influence. We do that, of course, in our active reading annotative work by asking three guiding questions. What does this text say? What does the text mean? How can I relate to this text in some meaningful way? Let's do some brief background biography stuff. Of course, we've said a lot about Woolf elsewhere, so we'll come here quickly. Her date's 1882 to, of course, the tragic 1941 suicide of Virginia Woolf. She was, of course, a part of that Bloomsbury group. As she talks about in her journals, though, there are all these men and then this brilliant woman, but at tea time, she's the one that's often expected to stand up and go make the tea, while the men continue to have their philosophic discussion. She writes about how frustrating this was for her. Of course, Room of One's Own is so important as a text in Room 303. The desire to find a place of your own for creative experience. All of us, male and female, have to find a way to enjoy that, no question. Now, Letter to a Young Poet is an essay, but it's really an essay as a letter, and I like what Jacobus has to say about it on 733, so I'm just going to read his fine prose. The solution, Woolf tells her friend, is for poetry to reclaim some of its former glory, to, quote, open its eyes, look out the window, and write about other people, end quote, paragraph 10. What a great suggestion, right? The poet, she tells him, produced Hamlet, Cleopatra, Falstaff, and dozens of other interesting characters and can do so again. She asks this young poet, and probably a contrivance to be honest, right, to attempt something of that sort, even though she knows this is not a simple solution. But she asks, how are you going to run out into the world of other people, end quote. Paragraph 11, by the way. She ruminates on this question and she makes a suggestion, quote, all you need now is to stand at the window and let your rhythmical sense open and shut, boldly and freely until one thing melts in another, until the taxis are dancing with the daffodils, end quote. And obviously one of the reasons we love Virginia Woolf is she blurs the line between poetry and prose, as all great writers will, right? Such a statement is curiously whimsical and poetical for a modern novelist, but when she tells him that his job is to find, quote, find the relation between things that seem incomparable, yet have a mysterious affinity, end quote. She is telling him that his job as a poet is quite similar to her job as a novelist, and of course that idea of comparing the unusual to something that we know, our learning theory, is born in many ways of Percy Bysshe Shelley's defense of poetry. You'll remember in another lecture we said about Shelley, I think we talk about it in To Skylark, that one of the things that Shelley said great poets do is they take the most obvious stuff, the song of a bird sitting in Ruthie's tree, we think of Lola as she comes back every spring, and somehow compare that in some way so that it's compelling and brand new. Woolf obviously suggesting as much. Ultimately, she encourages the young poet to write, right? That's what we've said for many years in 303. The only way you get good at something is to do it a lot. And of course, you want to be a good writer, you got to write a lot, right? So write. She says to be expansive, join poets who write about the world. She complains that modern poets create a poetry that is devoid of sights and sound, as if they were insensitive to the world around them. This is why our poetry out loud, our slam poetry, is so important for us at this time in our world. We need the words, and we need the emotion with the words, don't we? She asks, how can you learn to write if you write only about one single person? She asks in paragraph 13. And yet she suggests that the young poet publish nothing before he is 30. It's one of the famous injunctions, right? To experiment and give the rein to every impulse in paragraph 14 before thinking what people will say. She ends her letter by noting that poetry lives as long as young poets are inspired to write. And of course, we're hoping that continues to be the case. One of the reasons that we continue to share ideas out of 303 is that very reason, right? And of course, you're going to know a whole lot more after 30 than you know now. Just like, of course, you would tell a 6th grader doing hard math, it's nothing like calculus. Rhetorically, of course, we said this is the form of a letter, but it's really a fiction. It's, it's a way, it's a contrivance of some kind. Now, think about the power of a letter, though. Think about, for example, Lecture 11 that we gave in the World of Ideas lectures, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. The power of that kind of thing. And Jacobus, in fact, finishes his introduction to rhetoric by saying, Woolf naturally follows her own advice. She excuses herself as no expert in the opening paragraphs. Itself, the venerable rhetorical device of invoking the gods of humility. We think of Chaucer at the conclusion of the general prologue, I'm short of wit, as you will understand, right? But she knows that as a ranking storyteller, she participates in the world of poetry. As a novelist, she does now what Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton did in years gone by. But in her essay, and we could argue that on one count, as we've said in 303 many times, Woolf probably outdoes all 3 of those men, right, in terms of what she can create. But in her essay, she avoids writing about herself, which is a proof of just how humble she was. Instead, she urges her young poet to write the stories of many people and let those stories teach him to write. Well, let's go to work with this. Hey guys, I've had students that read this that say, wow, of all the stuff we've read of Woolf, this may be the coolest. Let's take a look at it. Paragraph 1. She says, there used to be an old gentleman who complained the penny post had killed the art of letter writing, but in fact that art is the child of the penny post, which, by making letters cheap to send, has freed them from their former status as important documents to be delightfully full of gossip, indiscretions, and vitality. We could say the same thing today about first emailing and then, of course, tweeting and then whatever comes next, huh? Paragraph 2. Before replying to your question, what's poetry, where poetry is going, or if it's dead, I must admit my lack of qualifications to answer. Being unfamiliar with the various meters and envious yet dubious, as all prose writers are, of rhyme and the other rules poets follow. In other words, I'm not sure I'm good enough to answer this. Again, the humility, right? The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless, T.S. Eliot writes. Ironically, of course, a contemporary of Woolf, as we said in those lectures on T.S. Eliot at Merkstrom. Paragraph 3, you imply that poetry may be in the direst straits ever. Never believe your own case harder than other people's. What a great line. Difficult as this is in our drama-hungry age. For in taking yourself seriously as a leader or follower, you become a clawing animal instead of the heir to a long, rich poetic tradition. I mean, what an amazing, just go back and paragraph 3 and just read it several times over and then let it speak to you. We have a tendency to think the sky is falling. This is the worst imaginable things that could ever happen in the world. I'm sorry, but we just don't understand. It's so young of an age. This is what she's saying. How much confusion, pain, suffering, this is our theodicy observation, right, has happened in the world. It happened before, it's happening now, it will happen again. The question of the poet is, how do you respond to it? How do you live within it? Conduct yourself, comport yourself. Paragraphs 4 through 6. Imagining myself in your place, she says, I see you, seized with the rhythm of poetry, yet frustrated in your attempts to write by the intrusion of ordinary incidences and people. Unlike Chaucer, Shakespeare, and others, poets of our time leave gritty reality to the novelists. When they do try to include it in a poem, they yoke it to the moon or the nightingale, and the poem splits apart. Paragraphs 7 through 9. I see you dismissing the sounds, the sights and sounds around you, and looking within yourself, the easiest subject for a poem. Present-day poets focus not on experiences and sensations we all share, but on the unique, inaccessible world of their own minds. This leaves poetry gasping for breath, indeed, but not dead. Now, this idea, of course, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot will try to respond to in the most important works of both of those, and of course, we've lectured that on Learn Strong as well. Paragraphs 10 through 11. Now that poetry has freed itself from the wreckage of the Victorian age and plumbed the mind of the poet, why should it not open its eyes and look out the window? The problem is to find the right relationship, that's the key, right, between the poetic self and the world. Your instinct of rhythm will take care of that if you saturate it with experience enabling you to condense and synthesize as novelists cannot, unless, of course, you're James Joyce, we might say, or we might say Virginia Woolf, To a Lighthouse, right? One of the greatest novels ever written. We believe in 303 anyway. Some of you smiling. Paragraphs 12, 13. When I read the poems of our contemporaries, she says, I'm agreeably caught up in hints optimistic, but also malcontent. I miss the beauty which English has such power to convey of sensory experience. This sounds in some ways like what Wordsworth says to Milton in his London 1802, right? Where are you? We need you. She seems to be suggesting something similar. The art of writing depends on knowing the language thoroughly enough to suggest as well as state. That is to say, show, don't tell, one of the famous injunctions in 303, right? Which comes from reading and even more from speaking in voices other than one's own. What a compelling idea. We are the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, and of course the stories we do reject ultimately, right? Paragraphs 14 through 16. Publish nothing, famous lines, before you're 30. Use these years to explore your imagination and develop your talent. The public eye will only confine and stifle you. Revel in life, and we need not worry about the death of poetry. Wow, I love that revel in life idea. The idea of don't publish before you're 30 is a fascinating idea in a world where, of course, we can tweet and post anything that we want at any moment in our life. Some have argued that maybe it makes more sense to tweet or speak less and listen more. And certainly Woolf wanting to suggest that. All right, at level 2 and 3, what does this text say for us at 2a? With our big five, epistemologically, what can you know? Well, still, this is, of course, a great rendering of the fallibilist position. Don't be so absolutist in your thinking, and don't be a relativist that says none of it matters, because to argue to say none of it matters, you have just made a comment that seems to matter. Instead, be a fallibilist, accept that you could be wrong, but still believe in standards and excellence and trying to be better. What a great invitation, right? Of course, ontologically, what does this text say? Well, artists and poets are obviously special and therefore very important people in our culture. Psychologically, what does this text say? We got to overcome the fear and then be unique, right? But do that within certain kinds of understandings of standards. You got to know the language before you can manipulate the language. That's why you got to become a reader, right? Sociologically, what are we saying here? Well, obviously, we're all in this world together. We depend upon each other. I depend upon you as you depend upon me. And, of course, it's symbiotic in that regards. Theodicically, that is to say, pain and suffering. I think Woolf, this is the tragedy of Woolf's life. She could help this poet, and yet ultimately the depression got to her. And, of course, tragically, we lost her far too early, we believe. Surely there were more stories left to be told. But I think even through and beyond the Ophelia-like, Virginia Woolf understandings, as we've talked about in other times, we can always remind ourselves that you have to learn to ask not why is this happening to me, but rather why is this happening for me. It's foundational, it's fundamental, I think, to appreciating what it is that she's arguing. Finally, at 2a, messages, well, obviously, art has to evolve. Poetry isn't dead. And of course, we can make the art. Just because most of you don't know who the current poet laureate of America is, what's a poet laureate? I'm kidding. I know that you know this. But still, I mean, to be fair, most people don't know, so they say poetry is dead. Poetry is not dead as long as you've got Netflix and you're watching shows. That isn't poetry. That is poetry. Just like reading great novels is poetry. It's all art, it's all expression, and it's all an attempt to try to somehow come to terms with this thing we call living in this world, right? It's all of those things. We live in a world that's at its same time, in its same moment, competitive and cooperative. It is both And yet, how is it possibly both? Art is the way that we understand that, which is why we are the stories we tell. Revel in life, joy. What is it that that Whitman says at the end of the day? Triumph, transformation, jubilant. And we got to keep that. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky, while at the same time recognizing there is pain and suffering in this world that we have to combat. No question about it. Both. To be, well, the power of the letter form, obviously. It can be both. Notice, informal as well as formal. It's quite brilliant. At 3a, notice, again, all of the stuff that Woolf wrote. We've talked about it so much I see some of you smiling. I will throw out, though, her pal E.M. Forrester, who we love, of course, in 303. Those novels, Room with a View, Passage to India, classic rendering. And, of course, you can't speak about Virginia Woolf and the suggestion to a poet without thinking about T.S. Eliot. Did Eliot accomplish the greatest thing in writing Love Song of Geoffrey Prufrock, then, of course, the poems Hollow Men and Wasteland, and then finally culminating with those 4 poems of 4 quartets? Go back and take a look at what I say about 4 quartets. I think some of the most amazing poetry, possibly very influenced by some of the things that Virginia Woolf will have said. Finally, at 3b, it's a fair question. Do you think poetry is dead? Do you think the arts are dead? I hope that you don't, and I hope that you will find a way. What is it Whitman says? To contribute a verse. Thank you.